right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome back to another episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don Never Misses a Cue Pizzette, back again with Mr. Ronnie Wong. How's it going, Ronnie?
I'm very excited. I've come up with a new possible show taking off of Breaking Bad called Fixing Good.
Fixing Good. And you'll make, delicious breakfast treats instead of methamphetamines?
Yeah, nothing. So, I thought it was a little bit funny, and so I thought we'd just throw that in there.
We're going to run with it. All right, so we're going to jump right back into project management today. We left off in our previous episode with the executing phase,
right?
Which, to be honest with you, was kind of boring, right? I mean, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot for us to do as a project manager. So you might have been scratching your head as you went through that, saying, "Man, there's a lot of watching. Watching stuff happen, but what am I doing? I'm doing nothing. I'm just watching and collecting data." Now we're going to talk about what we're supposed to be doing while that's happening, right? Now I know I've probably mentioned this 1,000 times, but let me just do it again. When we're in the executing phase, right, when execution is occurring, the project managers and most of the project management team is shifting their role over to monitoring and controlling. All right, now what does that mean? Monitoring. We're watching what happens, right? A lot of what we described in execution. We're watching that data, and then we're interpreting it. That's the unsaid thing right here, right? We're interpreting that data that we get to figure out how the project's going. And if things are going great, we sit back, we kick our feet up on the desk, and we continue monitoring, all right? But if things are not going right, if things are starting to go over budget or behind schedule or whatever, we need to do controlling. We step in and we do something about it, right? We take corrective action to ensure that our project stays on track, right? We need to keep the train on the rails so that we meet our destination as planned. So in monitoring and controlling, there's a lot for us to do. Planning was super busy for project managers, right? We do a lot in planning. The bulk of this show spent time in planning. The number 2 process, monitoring and controlling. All right, so inside of that process group, we got a number of different things, right? And we're going to dive into some of these and we'll kind of mix and match them. The very first process group is called Monitor and Control Project Work. And it's really an umbrella process that includes all the different processes underneath it. So we're going to start with a high-level view, of what we're expected to do in this group, and then we're going to start diving into the individual entities, all right? Where the real work is going to come in are these 2 guys down here: control schedule, control costs, control quality, these 3, right? But control schedule and cost, those are the ones we spend most of our time doing. Notice it's not monitor schedule or monitor cost. The monitoring is actually coming from execution and your progress reports and all that stuff, but we need to be able to control it. And we've got all sorts of really neat tools at our disposal. And by neat tools, what I mean is we've got some really cool mathematical formulas. Woo, right? And so in real life land, you're going to use a project management information system, a PMIS, something like Microsoft Project or Primavera, which will do these calculations for you, and they will predict the future. It's awesome, and with a high degree of accuracy. On the exam, we've got to be able to do them by hand. We have to do them ourselves with the formulas in our brains. So it does require some practice, some study, some memorization to get ready to do that on the exam. So we'll see that in an upcoming episode, not today's. All right, so let's get started right here in our project integration management knowledge area. All right, we got 2 different things here. The first one is that high level I mentioned. The second one is a really important one: performing integrated change control. I know we've talked about it a number of times, but never dived into it. So, all right, I'll quit stalling. Let's jump right into our first process group. All right, so our first process group is monitoring and controlling project work. All right, so this is that high-level umbrella that shows what we're going to be doing this entire time. For the most part, we're gathering data together, interpreting it, and then acting upon it. Right? And that's what the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs here reflect. The inputs, gathering data. Right? So what do we get data from? Well, our project management plan. That's important because it shows what we're supposed to be doing. What do we plan on doing today? Right? Then everything else shows not what we plan to do today, but what we actually did today. And when we have that information, when we have what we planned to do and what we actually did, you compare them. And the difference between the 2 is what's called variance, right? Anywhere we have variance, a deviation from what we planned, there's a problem, right? And don't be tricked into thinking there's good variance and bad variance. All variance is bad. but there's tolerances, right? You can tolerate a certain level of variance and still have a successful project. So you've got that window you've got to plan around. But we need to keep an eye on that, identify where it's starting to grow to be significant, and take actions to curb it back. All right, so that first one, that's what we're supposed to be doing. Then, schedule forecast, cost forecast, validated changes, work performance. These are what we are doing, what has happened, right? Schedule forecasts. That's our calendar, right? How well are we following our schedule? Based on what we've done so far, how does it look like we're doing? If we've been falling behind a little bit each week, if we schedule that out into the future, how bad is it going to be when the project finishes, right? We need a forecast to be able to determine that, and we get that from our historical data. Same thing goes for cost. If we've been spending more money or less money than we planned, what's that going to look like over time? Is it going to compound? Is it going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, that variance, right? And what can we do to stop it? Or is there a reason? There might be a very valid reason. I might have planned on buying 40 new servers this Friday, or last Friday, all right? And maybe that didn't happen. And so I called in, I'm like, hey guys, why didn't you buy those servers? And they said, well, it turns out there's going to be a big sale this coming Friday. And if we wait just 1 week, the sale will save us a bunch of money, and we can pay to overnight the servers and get them here faster and still pay less. So we're going to save money. That's great. Wonderful. We're going to save some money. That's why that variance is there. Now let's clear up the variance, right? Let's do a change ticket to say, oh, those servers aren't going to cost $50,000 anymore. Now they're going to cost $45,000, right? That's what we need to do. That's controlling that variance and making sure it gets entered into the project. Validated changes, right? Somebody put forth a change. And, change requests, we actually see it as an output right here. I think ever since we got into executing, every process we've seen has had change requests as a possible output. Well, just because a change request is output doesn't mean that it actually happens. Notice it's a change request. We're requesting the change board could deny it, right? So just because it's output doesn't mean it happens. But if it's accepted, if the change is allowed, then it gets put into place, and it's now a validated change. We validate to ensure the change was made as specified, and now we operate with that as part of our routine. So that's another input for us. All right, work performance information. Those are our progress reports, right? The status updates we're getting from the people who are doing the executing, right? People who are actually out there doing the work, reporting back their status. And then our favorites, enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets, right? So the things our company already has in the way we do business. So we've got that information too. All of that feeds into how we monitor and control the project. So once we've got that, now we need to interpret the data. We analyze the data, and if necessary, we act upon it, all right? So the number one way to do that is expert judgment, right? You're a project manager. You have a certain set of skills, things that you have in your mind that you know how to apply in this environment. It just made me think of that movie Taken with Liam Neeson. He says, I've got a particular set of skills. That's how a project manager is, and it's not as awesome as going to another country and rescuing your daughter, but you do get to keep your project on the tracks, moving along on schedule and on budget. That's what we want, and that's what we're doing with expert judgment. Now, analytical techniques. This is talking about how we break down that data. When you get all this information, it's not necessarily in a usable format, right? It's not listing stuff in the future, it's just listing right now. I mentioned we need to predict the future. Well, we use analytical techniques to do that. And you'll see, I'm in the wrong thing. All right, let's see. Oh shoot, I'm in the completely wrong thing. All right, well, when we talk about analytical techniques, we're talking about ways that we can analyze that data and turn it into usable information. And they call out a few specifically. Let me bring up that document. I've got the show notes for the last episode here. So we need to get into our
controlling and monitoring and integration, project integration.
There we go. Okay, so let me just find it here. There we go. Analytical techniques. So you'll see some of the different things that we can use to analyze that data, and there's quite a bit tucked away in here. Let me turn off my word wrap there. So things like regression analysis, right? When a change happens, how does that affect the rest of our project? Remember that a single change can cause a cascading change throughout your project, and you may find that by fixing one thing, you've actually broken something else. So maybe something was falling behind schedule, so you did a change request to say, hey, can we have a bit more time? The change request got approved. Great, that's solved. But by moving that one back, now you've got a constrained scheduled activity later on that can't move, and now it's overlapping with something else. You've created another problem. So looking at how an action or a change cascades through our project is basically what we do with regression analysis. We've got things like grouping methods, right? Where we can take the data that we're getting and group it together to form a big picture. If you're getting performance reports back from multiple people on the same team, you can aggregate that data together to form a team report, right? And there's a number of different group techniques that are out there. Causal analysis. This is one of my favorites. You will see stuff in the news all the time that'll say, you know, people who live in houses painted green have a higher chance of getting cancer, all right? There are a lot of times where you have causality and well, they call them like correlations and causality, and just because something correlates doesn't necessarily mean that you found the cause of the problem. So there's a lot of outlying factors that could cause cancer in a person who happens to live in a green house. It may just be coincidence that the house was green and that in that sample that we took, those people just had a higher degree of cancer. It could be the location of those greenhouses. Maybe houses closer to power lines have a tendency to be painted green more frequently. I don't know. But that's something we have to deal with causal analysis. We're trying to make sure that when we have an issue, we actually know the real cause, because you don't want to take a corrective action for something that isn't the true cause. All right, and that goes to root cause analysis, right? When you have a problem, what we normally see are the symptoms, and you don't want to correct the symptoms because the root cause is still there. You want to make sure you fix the cause. So if I have a blue jean manufacturing plant, and I'm manufacturing blue jeans and my fault rate starts climbing, my defect rate. So, you know, it starts at like 5% and then it gets to 6 and 7%. And before I know it, I'm at 15% of the blue jeans I create are defective, all right? And I look and I find out that there is a needle in one of the devices that's worn out, all right? And that's why my defect rate is higher. So I replace the needle, okay? Well, that fixes it, right? Well, no. The needle wore out. And so what's gonna happen to this new needle? It's going to wear out too. So while I've fixed the symptom, the needle was worn out and it was causing defects, I haven't fixed the root cause. The root cause is I don't have a good maintenance plan for that needle. I need to schedule it. If it takes 2 months for that needle to wear out, I should be replacing it every 6 weeks. And that way I replace it before it wears out. And so I stop the defects before they even start. That's what we can do with root cause analysis. We try and locate what that actual root cause is. All right, now forecasting methods. We are going to talk about this a lot in later episodes. When you have a schedule, when you have a budget, it's easy to look at the trend of what you've done and forecast it out into the future to get an idea of what's going to happen. All right, we're going to do something called variance analysis later, and EVA, or earned value analysis, and a couple of other ones. And we've got formulas for that, and a lot of really, really cool stuff to deal with. But we're going to just stick high level for this section right here. So what we do is we take the information we have and we just try and figure out what's going to happen from there. And it could take a number of different methods. Time series are what we normally do, or what I normally do. If I lay out week after week after week after week what things have been like, I can estimate what it's going to be like in the future, just following that same trend. But you can do other things like scenario and simulation. You know, simulation are like the what-if scenarios. We do that with scheduling. You say, like, what if this activity fell behind schedule? How would that affect everything else? So you start kind of trending to figure out what may happen there. Failure mode and effect analysis, right? Very similar to like the what-if simulations. If something fails, if a particular activity were not to come off successful, what's the effect? What's the effect on the rest of the project? You can do this hopefully beforehand, but you can do it afterwards too. You've had a failure. Something's gone, you know, behind schedule or over budget. Now we start to look at the effect. We analyze across our systems to find out where that is. Fault tree analysis. This one's we don't really use in IT very much, but in like manufacturing and stuff, this is where you have a root cause, and then you have all the various symptoms that branch out from it, right? So you try, and that's why they call it the fault tree analysis. So we start kind of figuring that out. You have defects. Why? there could be more than one reason leading to that defect. And so you start kind of gauging those together. We talked about this a bit with like fishbone or Ishikawa diagrams. It's the same concept here with fault tree analysis. Reserve analysis. Okay, reserve analysis is if we've set aside time and money, or time or money, as a reserve for our project, how do we know when to use it? Well, when we created that reserve, we should have designated exactly when we were going to use it. So how do we know when it's time? Somebody needs to be looking at the project, looking at the activities that are occurring, and identifying when the time is right to pull from those reserves. That's reserve analysis. All right. The other thing is, as we start to pull from the reserves, somebody should be double checking to ensure that we're not going to run out, right? That we haven't exceeded the amounts that we allocated back in the original plan. If you're doing proper change management, it's impossible. You know, you manage that. But if you're not doing good change management, people could be pulling from the reserves when they shouldn't be. And that could be, well, two problems, right? One would be impropriety, right? They could be stealing or embezzling funds from the reserve. Or two, it could just be, you know, they're pulling from it, not reporting it. So now they're trying to hide the fact that they went over budget or over schedule. And the result is that you're less capable to correct for errors later in the project. And that's when things become really sensitive.
Yep.
All right, trend analysis, I've kind of already talked about with forecasts. If you've got a repeating sequence of events, you can look at the trend. The Blue Jean example. Week after week, my defect rate was increasing, going up more and more each week. Well, you use that to build a trend. All right, hey, it looks like I'm increasing by 3% each week. If I keep going like that, in X amount of weeks, I'm going to be at 100% failure rate. So that's something we can predict. Earned value management. I mentioned that one earlier. EVM, or earned value management, you also hear it's EVA, earned value analysis. These are a collection of formulas. And what they do is they let you aggregate two things. Basically, when you're performing an activity, the two main things that we track are schedule and budget, right? Schedule is measured in time, and budget is measured in dollars. And what EV does is it combines the two, right? It quantifies them, turns them into numbers, and then combines them to create a single number. And that number is a reflection of the progress you've made on that activity. If I've got a 4-day activity with a $1,000 budget, if I've spent $500 and I'm on day 2, that's 50% of my budget, 50% of my schedule, I should be 50% complete of that activity, right? 50% complete being a reflection of both schedule and cost, right, of money. So it aggregates those two together into a single value. You can then use that to create things like a schedule performance index or a cost performance index, which are, again, just reflections of your budget and your schedule. As a project manager, we work with these numbers a lot. And these are some of the formulas that we're going to have to learn, and we'll talk about in the next episode. But for regular people, your project team members, your stakeholders, they don't understand earned value analysis. So this is a set of numbers that we use, but when we communicate it out, we've always got to translate it into language that other people understand. You don't really see these used outside of project management. All right, and when we have earned value calculated, we usually calculate it in two ways. One is the earned value that we should have at this point according to our plan, and the other is the earned value that we actually have according to what's been done. We look at the difference, and that's our variance, which leads to variance analysis. If there's a difference, we need to find out why and try and correct it. Or if it's within our tolerances, then we let it ride, and you go from there. So it just kind of depends on how your project is going.
Yeah. All of these different types of analysis are really there to help us to be able to take whatever we've done in the past, take that information, and then actually be able to forecast into the future. But part of that, of course, is then knowing exactly where you are in relationship to what you started. So a lot of these things here, right, in terms of controlling the project and monitoring, right, is always about taking a look at that past and go, okay, here's a great way that we can see a little bit into the future here. And so once you actually start getting these techniques down, as you continue to go on toward the PMP exam, you've got to actually kind of bear down, and you'll see that the rest of this, when we get into the rest of controlling here, we're going to get into some detailed formulas. You got to know those.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we'll spend a good bit of time on that. The only other two things we've got are the PMIS, the Project Management Information System, and good old-fashioned meetings, right? So those are all some of the things that we're going to be using. when it comes to the analytical techniques of breaking down our project work, right? It's a lot, right? We need to analyze this stuff. If you have a PMIS, you feed the data into it, and it generates it all for you. All the formulas that we're going to learn, Microsoft Project has them built in. You just punch in your data, and it does all the calculations, gives you the numbers. You don't even have to know the formula exists. On the exam, you do.
The value of the PMIS that I've found when I've used it is that ability for it to create the reports that I want and to be able to visually see the baseline versus the variances here, and then to see the forecasting of how far I'm going to be in 2 weeks of time from now. A lot of times, me just looking at a spreadsheet or a number doesn't really help me out until I can see that, and that's where that PMIS really does help.
All right, now on our outputs, this is going to be what we release as a project manager. When we see a problem that we have to step in and correct, when we have to do a control, the result is always a change request, right? You've got to make a change for that to happen. The exception is drawing from the reserves when it was a planned for reserve, right? You don't have to do a change ticket for that because it was already planned for. Same thing with a risk. If you've already formulated your risk response, you don't need a change ticket for that. The risk response is there. So it's when we have variance, when we have a risk we didn't expect, when we have a change we didn't expect, when we have a budget shortage or a schedule overage that we didn't expect. Those are where we need that change request, right? Other outputs, work performance reports. Now, a work performance report was really an input here, work performance information. We're just translating it into whatever form our company requires as part of our organizational process assets, or as something that we communicate out to our stakeholders. We also have our project management plan updates and project document updates, things we kind of expect to see. But the main output is going to be a set of change requests or nothing. If things are running great and smooth, there is no output, right? Well, you have your reports, I suppose, but then otherwise you stop there. But if there's a problem, change requests are what you create to try and get things back in line. All right, and I think that's basically it for that one. Did I leave anything out?
Nope.
Yeah, we're going to post these notes with the episodes. We always do. Ronnie does amazing notes on some of these as far as like exactly which section these are discussed in the PMBOK and so on. But the majority of these are ones we've already seen, so nothing we need to dive into too deeply. All right, well, that's monitoring and controlling the project work. The other piece of this project, or this process group, is perform integrated change control, and that's a big topic. I know we've said repeatedly in other episodes, yeah, we'll talk about change control later. Well, now's that time, all right? Well, now's almost that time. We don't really have enough time left in this segment, so why don't we stop and take a break, and when we get back, we'll jump into change control and start to describe that process, what's involved, and how important it is. So stay tuned. We'll be back after this. All right, welcome back, everybody. So now we're going to take a moment and talk about change control. All right, change control is a very, very important part of our project. We'd spend a lot of time planning for what's going to happen during our project, and we want to make sure that things go off without a hitch. But we know that things might not go exactly as planned, and we might have to change. Change is not a bad thing, right? It can be sometimes, but it isn't normally. So what we need to do is we need to prepare for it, and when change happens, it's okay as long as we fully understand the change. We don't want to do any, shooting from the hip, knee-jerk reaction to problems because they may have larger repercussions that we're not ready to deal with, or that we just don't foresee. We make one little change that doesn't seem to be that big of a deal, and a few months later it turns out to have been a massive mistake that's going to be difficult to correct from. These are the types of problems that we can have. So change control helps to prevent that. Now, there are many very different schools of thought on how to properly implement change management. PMI kind of leaves it open to you and your company to pick from the various methodologies that are out there. But they all basically work the same way. You come up with a plan and you stick to it. And anytime you deviate from that plan, you have to fill out a change request, a form of some sort that details the change you want to make. That change then goes before either a single person in like a dictatorial environment or a board, a group of people that will make the decision over to whether that change should be approved or not. If it's approved, then the project corrects itself and moves ahead as planned, or as it's newly planned. If the change is not approved, the change is declined, and now your project is set up for failure. You need to find either another way to correct it, or that's it, you failed. All right, so that's basically the two outcomes of a change ticket. So it's a neat system in that it does work really well. The change board could be called anything. You might have a change advisory committee, a change control board, all sorts of different names that are out there. You hear CAB a lot, a change advisory board, or change approval board. I've heard that one too. So different names that are out there, but it doesn't matter. They do the same thing. They're just approving or declining a change in your environment. All right. Sometimes the rejection of that change is not an outright no, we're not going to do it. It's we need some more information. You need to gather some more data and provide it to us. So it's postponing the change to make sure we have all the necessary information to make the right call. All right. So why do they call it integrated change control? Well, a lot of companies probably have change control already for their standard environment. Like let's say you're a bank and you've got online accounting software. If you make a change to that online accounting software without testing it, what can happen? It could all go offline, or you could open yourself up to a security vulnerability and leak out your customer data. You don't want that. So anytime somebody goes to make a change to that software, they need to get it approved. Somebody needs to review the code they're pushing in and then authorize it to be rolled out, right? It's just simple taking the right precautions, right? Doing the best practices. Well, in your project, you may have a change that pertains to the project. Now, the project is creating something that isn't there yet, typically. So it's not like you're changing production systems. So you don't necessarily want to use the change control system that's a part of your organization already. Instead, you want to have a change control system that is integrated into the project, that's built into your project system, that may be different. It may be the same as the change control system for your organization, but a lot of times it'll be separate because it'll be the stakeholders, the key stakeholders, and the project manager, the people that are involved in the project. All right. So when we talk about performing integrated change control, we're talking about basically doing that change control that's a part of our project and ensuring that the project is moving in the right direction. All right, so what are our inputs for this? Well, the inputs are simple. We need to have our plan. Our plan is what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be following this, all right? But apparently there's a deviation. The deviation is normally going to be recognized by our work performance reports. That's going to show where our deviation is, all right? And then as a project manager, we recognize the deviation, and so we create a change request to fix it. Now, I say the project manager. Most change requests will come from the project manager. But that doesn't mean they have to. Change requests can come from anywhere within the project. Anybody can submit that. And another common place to get it is from the sponsor. The project sponsor says, man, this project is awesome, and I know you guys have been working on it for 6 months now, but I had this idea. I had this idea for a great new feature. Can we add this feature to the project? And you say, ooh, can we finish this project and then add it as like project 2.0 or something like that? And they say, oh no, let's try and get it for launch date. Let's try and get it as part of this project. And you say, all right, well, it's going to take more money and it's going to take more time. And the sponsor says, well, I'm not okay on time. I want this on launch date, but I'm cool on money. I can add more money to the project. We can do that. Well, that is a change that the sponsor's pushing. They're willing to pay for it. Might as well bring it in, right? That's what they want, and we'll provide the customer what they need. So those type of change requests might originate from somebody other than the project manager. The other place you might get change requests are from contractors. When you contract out to them, you've got a contract that specifically states what they're going to be doing, that statement of work and all that other information they signed off on. They might have a change. Something happens, something unforeseen, and a change might occur. So all of these things, they originate from different places, but they go through the same approval process. We have our change committee that's going to review those changes and determine whether or not we should accept them or decline them. All right. Now, enterprise environmental factors, that's the way that our company does business. And if we already have a change advisory board or change control system or whatever, we just make use of that. All right. Organizational process assets, that's going to be detailing things like the paperwork, the forms, the bureaucracy. When somebody fills out a change request, what is that? What is the request? Well, let me show you an example. So I've got a change request right here, and this is an example of what one would look like when we fill it out. All right. So you fill it out with what the project is, who the project manager is, when this was prepared, who the requester is, because it might not be the project manager, and a change number if we're keeping track of that. This might be blank when you submit it and it gets numbered after it's submitted, right? Then we identify what it is we're trying to change. Are we trying to change our scope, right? Modifying our requirements list, and they've got scope and requirements kind of separate here. Do we want to modify our quality, cost, schedule, just general documentation? What is it that we're wanting to modify? And it might be a combination of these, right? Then we specify what the change is, all right? So let's say, for example, that I've got a project and I was supposed to purchase 40 servers from Dell. When it comes time for me to purchase them, they tell me they're back ordered. And they say, no, their back order is going to be an extra 3 weeks. Well, I know that's going to shoot our schedule. So I want to make sure that doesn't happen. So I decide, well, you know what? Let me go and purchase them from HP. It's the same price, just a different vendor, and I can get them on the schedule that I want. So I come in here and I say, what am I going to modify? Well, I'm actually going to be modifying not our cost or our schedule, right? Because those are going to stay the same. What I'm going to modify are my procurement documents, because we're going to be buying from HP instead of Dell, and more than likely my requirements. If the requirement said we need to purchase the servers from Dell, I'm wanting to change that to HP. And so I'll specify that here in my detailed description of proposed change. I'll say requesting to purchase servers from HP instead of Dell in order to meet, in order to meet schedule plan, or plan schedule. And then we can indicate, cost and schedule will remain unchanged with HP, right? Or maybe it's less money or more money, we might need to indicate that. Justification for the proposed change? Well, the change results in maintaining the planned schedule without incurring additional costs, which is what I want, right? If it cost more money, I would have to justify that and say, look, we got two choices here. We can spend a little more money now, or we can take a 3-week delay. Which one would you rather do? You could submit 2 change tickets. One that recommends extending the schedule 3 weeks, one that recommends spending a little more money so you don't have to do it. One will get approved, one will get declined, but it's not you, the requester, that's making that decision. It's the change board that makes that call. So you may have 2 tickets that conflict with each other. That's definitely not uncommon. All right, so then impact of change. Well, the impact is going to be negligible, so we might indicate server configuration software is different, but functionality impact is negligible, right? So, whatever it is that we need to dictate in here. So impact is negligible. Which I think I'm spelling wrong. Yep. There we go. All right, any other comments that I might want to add? And then we submit it. Now, the second page is not for us, the submitter. It's the change advisory board. They're going to review this, okay? Did we give them enough information, right? I didn't really put all that much data here, right? So if we didn't put enough information, they may decline this requesting information, right? Or they may just decline it outright and say, no, let's stick with the ordering from Dell. Let's deal with the time delay, right? Or they might approve it. And if they approve it, they'll indicate that here and do the justification for disposition, all right? If we decline it, why did we decline it? If we approve it, why did we approve it? And if we defer it, right? This is usually when we request more information, we indicate that here and say, well, you looked at Dell and HP, are there any other vendors, right? Have you checked anybody else? Or have we checked to see if there's a third party that sells Dell that we could have gone with, right? And then the change control board or change advisory board or whoever signs off right here, their name, their role, their signature. So now we know who made the decision and why, all right? This process right here ensures that nobody's making changes to the schedule without proper review happening. And the people doing the review should be at a minimum the project manager, right? Somebody who understands the ramification of that change. What is it going to do to the rest of my project if I make this change? All right. Who are some of the other people we might have on that board? Well, at a minimum, you want your project manager. You'll normally have your project sponsor too, the one who's just ponying up the dough, right? Who's paying for all this. They had a budget and they had a schedule that we promised them. Now we want to change it. So they need to be involved in that. And they may be very cool with this stuff. They may be like, a couple extra grand, no big deal, or a couple extra weeks, fine. but they may be very strict, and they may say, you know what, you promised we'd have it on this date for this much money. You need to make it happen. So they may be declining that, and that's definitely their prerogative, right? We made promises, we need to try and keep them. So those are two people who might be there. Who else? Subject matter experts, right? We might need to have specialists, people who understand this change more in depth as part of that change control board. We might want to have other project managers. That's something that I'm kind of fond of. Getting another project manager to get their eyes on this, that second set of eyes, can be very, very handy. All right. They sign off on it, and that's it. Now the change is in play. When a change request gets approved, if we're changing, in our case, the requirements list and other documents, I need to go and edit those. I need to go edit my requirements list to reflect the new requirements. If we edit our schedule, we need to go edit the schedule to reflect that. That becomes part of our baseline. That's our new schedule that we follow. So your schedule, you really only have one schedule. It just changes with each change ticket. You want to record the old ones, the baseline, so you can use them in your lessons learned later on. You know, here's what we thought was going to happen, here's what actually happened. But once a change takes effect, that new schedule is the official schedule, so that you're now living off of that one. All right. Now, whenever there's a change, there might be more than one change, so we'll oftentimes maintain a change log. It's a good idea, right? The change ID, the category, what it was, who submitted it, the status, and the disposition, right? Status, whether it's pending or reviewed, disposition, whether it was accepted, declined, or deferred, right? So we keep track of that here, each of our changes, because you might have 5 changes, you might have 5,000 changes. If you've got a 10-year project, you'll probably have tons of changes across there. So we need to maintain a log so that we can keep track of what changes happened when. All right, so those are all key components of that change control and change request process. All right, so the tools and techniques we have, expert judgment, right? We've got to use our project management knowledge to evaluate the change and see how it's going to impact things. We'll probably have to have meetings. If you've got a change control board, you got to get together, review the changes. If you need more information, it's a good idea to have the people come to you, and you just talk to them and get that information instead of doing report after report after report. And then change control tools, well, these are whatever it is that you use as your change control structure. Do we actually have? Nope. Oh, we don't have any listed. But these are going to be things like the change advisory board itself, your change request tickets, and your change request tickets can actually be a lot more detailed than this. For example, in IT, I almost always add at least one more field to this. If they're going to make a change to the software, right, pushing in a change, I like to have a rollback plan to say, all right, if you're changing the software and it doesn't work, how do you roll back? How do you take that change back out again so we can then get back to the way we were? So you might have a rollback plan or things of those nature. It just depends on what your organization needs. So those are some of the tools that are available to us. Now the outputs are going to be a few things. The outputs will most commonly be approved change requests. We approve them. The change request now becomes part of our project baseline. So we go and we update our project management plan and our project documents, right? We update those things, all right? We also update that change log to reflect the change that we made. Very important there, right? The output could be a declined change request. Now, PMI doesn't actually detail that here as an output, but it could be a decline. And in that case, that's where people have to go back to the drawing board, either come up with another solution or revise the proposed solution to meet whatever our needs are that cause the decline. All right. So a lot of different things happen there. You can go out and there's a lot of like specific methodologies for doing change control. PMI doesn't really care which one you use. They just want to make sure that you're using one, right? That there is a gatekeeper in between making changes and actually having them stick. So somebody needs to be doing some peer review, looking at those changes and making sure they're good for the project.
Yeah, one of the hardest things to understand is when a change occurs in the project and nobody knows what has happened. Who's made the change, who approved it, when it happened, but it's just done. So the idea of actually integrating this into the control process here so that we know when it's happening, it gives us that ability to actually be able to back out if we need to, or again, to actually accept the change. But it's just one of those things where if you don't know what's happened and it's happened, well, what can you do? You just kind of have to accept it, or you have to now actually go back to your project sponsor and say, it's changed at some point, I can't account for it, and that's when you're in trouble.
Yeah. The other scenario is when you have two changes at once, right? If you have two people who are making adjustments and they're bumping into each other, right? With the change advisory board, you're controlling that. You're setting them up in a sequential order, and they see all the changes, so they would know if 2 different ones are happening at the same time. But it does require people to follow that change process. Whatever it is that we set up in our organization, the employees have to follow it. They're the ones who have to obey the rules that we set aside.
Yeah.
So.
Awesome.
All right, well, that's pretty much integrated change control. I know it doesn't seem like a ton here, but it's probably one of the most important processes we have in monitoring and controlling, because this is how we correct, how we control. It's the tool that we use. And we're going to talk about a lot of other things as we go through this section, but that's one of the more important ones.
Right.
All right. Well, let's stop here and take a break. When we get back, we're going to take a look at some other process groups. We've got scope management that we're going to talk about next, validating and controlling scope. So stay tuned for that. We'll be back after this. All right, welcome back, everybody. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our scope, monitoring and controlling the scope. Now, the scope, you'll remember from way back in the beginning, is pretty important in the project. It's where we lay out what it is we hope to achieve, right? And our list of requirements. Now, we're normally going to incorporate our schedule and our budget into the scope, but let's put those out of our mind for right now because they have their own processes for management. So what's left in the scope is really your requirements list. How do we ensure that our requirements are being met? And for that, we have the validate scope process, right? The process is really straightforward because what you're really doing is just taking your requirements list and making sure it gets done. I mean, how hard is that? It's just doing basic inspection of what's happening. So if we look at our inputs, our project management plan, right? Which includes things like our scope statement and our requirements documentation, which is typically attached to the scope statement. So we've got that information. Our requirements traceability matrix is important because if we have some kind of issue with a requirement, we need to know who is responsible for that requirement, who's responsible for doing it, also who created that requirement so that we can reach out to them. So that's supporting information that we need. Our verified deliverables. Now, this one was always a weird one for me. Here I am in validating my scope, and I've already got verified deliverables. What's that all about? Well, when you're dealing with a project team, they're creating deliverables. The deliverables usually match up with milestones. They're not necessarily the final product. You might have 5 different deliverables that all combined create your final product that meet your scope and requirements list. So a deliverable by itself is not necessarily the end result of your product or your project, right? So we just need to be aware that there is some variation in terminology there. So when somebody creates a deliverable, when they provide a service or a good, we have our acceptance criteria, right? How do we know whether it meets our needs? Or what we specified. And if it meets all of our specifications, then it becomes an accepted deliverable. We need that here for validate scope because that accepted deliverable, that verified deliverable, is going to be a part of our final scope. It's going to meet at least a portion of the requirements that we've got, right? And then our work performance data to see, how people are moving along, all key components of validating the scope. As far as what we apply to it, though, there's not really much to this one. Inspection is the number 1 entry, and usually it's the only one for us. Inspection, we look at the work that's being done, the work that's being produced, and run it down our checklist. Is it meeting our requirements? Does it meet what we specified out in the very beginning of this project? All right. So if I required a 4-bedroom house to be built, I don't have to wait for the house to be done to verify that it has 4 bedrooms, right? After they've laid the foundation and they start framing the walls, I can walk in there and see, did they lay out 4 bedrooms, right? Doesn't match up with the blueprints that we specified. A simple inspection will reflect that. If it doesn't meet our requirements, then we can take action then. It's much easier to fix a house that's framed out incorrectly if it was just framed versus once they have the drywall and the roof on and all that other stuff, then it becomes a nightmare to redesign it. So we want to catch this stuff early. Validating the scope is an ongoing process. We're doing it over and over and over again while the execution phase is going on. We're monitoring and controlling, they're executing. Watch what they do, inspect it, and make sure it meets your needs, right? What if it's something beyond your talents and abilities though, right? There's a lot of things that you might not be an expert in. So in that case, we might need things like group decision-making techniques, where you bring your group together to evaluate that information and come up with that decision as to whether or not our scope is being accurately reflected in the work that's being done. So, that's stuff we need to keep an eye on to keep the project moving forward. the biggest thing to remember is the earlier you catch a variance, the more time you have to fix it. The later you catch that variance, the harder it becomes to fix it, the more things you have to change. So change in a project becomes very dangerous later on in the life of the project. We always want to try and catch that stuff early. Our outputs are pretty straightforward. If you have a verified deliverable, a deliverable you've received, and it matches everything that you've specified in your requirements under inspection, then it becomes an accepted deliverable. We accept it. It is what we asked for in this project. It does provide what we needed. Okay, so that's an accepted deliverable. That's the difference between a verified and an accepted. All right. If it doesn't meet our requirements, if it isn't what is in line with our scope, then we go into change requests. And the change request is going to be one of two things. Either one, providing more resources to correct the mistake, right? Either more money, more time, or more people to correct the mistake. Or two, it's going to be an adjustment to the requirements, to change the requirements and eliminate some of those items in the requirements list to match the deliverable that I actually got, right? Maybe I'm dealing with developers, programmers, and they're writing a special website for me. And I had my primary objectives, 1 through 5, and then I had some secondary objectives, 1 through 10. And they met 1 through 5, but they were only able to get through a handful of the sub-objectives, right? You know, the secondary ones that I didn't necessarily care about as essential. They only met half of them. So what I might do is I might look at it and say, okay, you only met half of them, but I'm okay with that. I'll do a change ticket that says, let's just trim off those other ones that we didn't meet, and we'll move those into another project somewhere else, right? I don't need to assign more time. I don't need to assign more resources in this project. I'm just removing those requirements, all right? So that's very possible, especially when you've got contingency type items in your plan.
Yeah. The validating the scope for us, right, really helps us to make sure that we continue on that progress here and that we are making true progress in our project here, okay? Without the idea of being able to validate this, right? We're just trusting that everybody's actually saying, I'm getting done what I need to get done here. Validation is a good way to go, okay, here's where you should be, and I'm here to check it so that we know that we're actually continuing on this process. So the idea of skipping this validation is not something we want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, you end up in that situation where people complete all their work, and there may have been mistakes that were made that weren't caught, and now it's done. It's really hard to go back and make those changes.
Yeah.
All right. The last things we have here for outputs, work performance information, right, which is just interpreted work performance data, and project document updates, right? If we chose to change our scope or whatever, then we need to go and make those modifications. But all in all, this is really straightforward. It does really boil down to inspection. You go and examine what's being done, you run down your list of requirements and make sure that they're being met. You tick them off as you go, you know, check, check, check. And when they're all checked, your project is done.
That's it.
Well, in theory. So the next process we're going to take a look at is the control scope process. Now, that sounds a lot like validate scope that we just talked about, and they really go hand in hand. You don't do one without the other. Validating the scope was all about gathering data and making sure the work that was being done conformed to our requirements list. Controlling the scope is making sure that we don't go beyond what's really happening inside of our scope statement. This is something that's very, very common. We have a term, it's called scope creep. And that's where people start adding stuff to your project after the fact. So sure, you define this nice little scope, a list of requirements for a website that's going to be designed. And then as you're going through it, the sponsor or whoever comes in and says, you know, can we change that background to be blue? No, that's an innocent request, not a big deal. Sure, we'll change it to blue, right? We won't even do a change ticket. We'll just go ahead and do that, not a big deal. And then they say, well, while you're in there, can you change this text around? And, you know, I really don't like that font. Can we make that bigger? And all of a sudden it starts to snowball and it gets bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden you're spending so much time on these little innocent changes that you fall behind on the other activities, all right? That's scope creep. It's a very real problem, very prominent, especially when the extra activities, the extra add-ons are coming from the sponsor, the person who's paying for all this. All of a sudden, your project gets out of hand. So controlling the scope is all about making sure that doesn't happen, making sure that the work that's being done is in line with what's defined in our scope and requirements documentation. The inputs for it are almost identical to validating the scope. Project management plan, right? That's where our scope statement is stored. Our requirements documentation, basically the checklist of what should be happening. Our requirements traceability matrix, who it was that's tied to each of these requirements, who's responsible for completing it, or who initiated that requirement. our work performance data, that we're gathering from the employees that are working in the field, and finally our organizational process assets, like we always see, almost identical to what we had with Validate Scope. The big difference here is our tool and technique. We have variance analysis, right? Under Validate a Scope, our main thing was inspection, right? We would go and inspect the work and see what was going on. Variance analysis, though, is a lot different. This is where we look at what's been done and we compare it to what should have been done and look for deviations. Requirements are easy to measure on. If there were requirements that weren't done, you spot them, right? But things like schedule and budget, right, our time and our money, if we see variations there, we need to ask the question of why. Why have we spent more money than we should have, right? Or why haven't we spent as much money as we planned? Either one can indicate work that hasn't been done. If you spent too much money, you probably have scope creep. New things have worked their way in and you're wasting money on them, right? Or people are not doing the work they said they were doing, right? If you haven't spent enough money, it usually means people are behind. They haven't gotten to certain activities yet that require us to spend money. So even though it looks like you're under budget, you're actually falling behind on the project. So we need to monitor for that variance. And this is where our earned value analysis comes in, EVA, and earned value management, EVM. We're going to talk about those in the next episode. But they're all tools at our disposal to go and identify where we're deviating, where we've got that variance from our original plan. Almost always indicates that something's happened to our scope, that we're not following it.
Yeah, a lot of times in terms of changes, right, that end up going on and we getting scope creep, and we actually end up with scope creep in our project, what ends up happening here is that it's not that changes can't go on. We've already talked about the process here of integrating change management, and those are accounted for. What we're worried about here is the idea of the uncontrolled changes that end up getting added in, the uncontrolled expansion that we have here. And variance analysis is what will help us to identify, especially that, okay, when we're actually close to the end or when we're starting this process. Either way, we're going to see that. Without this particular part of the variance analysis, very difficult for us to even know where we actually started that scope creep and how to even control it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you guys see where this really fits in with Validate Scope. We do these hand in hand. You typically do them at the same time. We don't even really treat them as separate processes. And I imagine in some future version of the PMBOK, they'll just combine these two. But for right now, the idea is that it is a little bit separate, that validating the scope, just making sure we meet our requirements, controlling the scope, making sure we don't deviate from those requirements, just kind of two separate ideas. Our outputs, again, almost identical to validate the scope. Our work performance information, right, what's been done, which is just interpretations of work performance data. We've got change requests, anything we need to modify to get back in line. Our project management plan updates, if those requests are approved, we've got to modify the plan. Project document updates, and organizational process asset updates also, right? All pretty much in line. So very, very similar. If I were to flip back and forth between these two, you'll notice that they are almost identical. A few extra outputs on control, but very similar, still two separate entities. That makes it really easy to confuse them on the exam. So these are good ones that we need to memorize and make sure we remember. All right, well, that pretty much wraps up that piece. Now, I know it seems like we've been moving through these pretty quick, right? Under monitoring and controlling, we just knocked out these first two knowledge areas, right? But we're about to move into some really complex things, controlling the schedule and controlling costs. And that's when we're gonna break into our formulas. So we don't want to jump into it today. We don't have enough time left in this episode. But in our next episode, we're going to dive into that world of formulas. It's going to be a ton of fun, right?
Yes.
Anyhow, it can be a lot of fun. Depends on how you apply it. But we'll get a chance to see that next time. All right. Well, let me remind you guys, if you have questions on anything that we've covered here, feel free to ask. Live during the show, you can go to itpro.tv/live. You'll see the chat box right beneath the video. Post your questions. We monitor and answer during the show. If you have questions after the show when we're in reruns, use our Q&A forums. At the top of every page is a link that says Q&A. Click on it. Takes you into the forums. You can post your questions there. We monitor and answer. Take advantage of that resource. It is there for you. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed the show. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I'm Don Pizzette.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
And we will see you next time.